The Thorne estate living room smelled of lavender and unacknowledged history. The space remained a sterile vacuum where the dust of reality was never permitted to settle. Marissa Vance stood by the mahogany sideboard, looking at the surroundings with the detached precision of a professional auditor. It had been 25 years since the name Marissa Thorne had existed in this house. The woman standing there now was the CEO of Vance Senior Care Partnerships, a person who understood the geography of aging better than the people who currently inhabited the mansion. Margaret Thorne lay in a hospital bed positioned in the center of the room. The woman who had once commanded the city's social circles was now a fragile figure, though a core of stubborn authority remained in her gaze. Across the room, Clara Thorne, the younger sister and the family's longtime favorite, paced back and forth. Clara spoke of art galleries and emotional overextension, arguing that the burden of a mother's care was a weight the younger sister could no longer carry. The meeting had been called to discuss stewardship. Clara argued that because Marissa owned a senior care empire, it was Marissa's natural responsibility to move back into the estate and act as Margaret's primary caregiver. Margaret agreed, suggesting that duty to blood was the ultimate obligation. The conversation ignored the 25 years of silence that had followed Marissa's departure. It ignored the reason the departure had happened in the first place. 25 years ago, in this same room, Margaret Thorne had issued an ultimatum. A 20-year-old Marissa had been pregnant and terrified. Margaret, fearing for the family's reputation and Clara's social debut, had forced Marissa to give the child up for adoption. The threat was total disinheritance. Marissa had complied, signed the papers, and disappeared into a world that didn't care about the Thorne name. The mother had prioritized a portrait over a daughter, and the daughter had spent 2 decades building a fortress of her own. As the discussion continued, Marissa presented a leather folder containing the reality of the Thorne finances. Clara insisted that the family trust was vast and that Marissa simply needed to coordinate the logistics of Margaret's care. Marissa corrected this assumption. The Thorne Living Trust was a work of fiction. Julian Thorne, the family's trusted financial partner, had spent years gambling the family assets on speculative tech ventures and Ponzi schemes. Julian had officially vanished, leaving the accounts empty and the estate leveraged to the point of collapse. The realization of financial ruin hit the room with more force than any emotional plea. Margaret's command over the conversation vanished. Clara collapsed into a velvet chair, speaking of family, friends, and loans. Marissa pointed out that in the social world Margaret and Clara had built, dependency was viewed as a moral failure. The friends would disappear as soon as the word debt was mentioned. The lavender-scented world of the Thorne family was about to be foreclosed upon. The argument shifted to empathy. Clara accused Marissa of being a monster who took pleasure in the family's downfall. Marissa clarified that the current situation was not about pleasure, but about accounting. Margaret Thorne had calculated that a daughter's presence as a mother was a liability 25 years ago. Marissa Vance had now calculated that a mother's presence as a dependent was a liability for Vance Holdings. The logic was a mirror of the lesson Margaret had taught in the parlor decades before. Marissa explained the costs of premium care. To enter a Vance facility like Oak Ridge, a client required 3 years of upfront funding, nearly $800,000. Margaret had $0 and $3 million in personal debt left by Julian. Professional dignity, Marissa stated, required arithmetic that the Thorne family could no longer perform. The heart of the family had failed to manage the ledger, and the cold child had no intention of rewriting the numbers to suit a performance of family unity. Marissa stood to leave, but Clara blocked the study doors. The younger sister demanded to know who would pay the foreclosure lawyers and who would move the mother to a new location. Clara spoke of her own emotional core and the advice of her therapist. Marissa suggested that Clara look for a liquidation sale rather than empathy. The performance of the perfect family was over, and the curtain had fallen on an empty stage. The departure of Marissa Vance from the Thorne estate was final. She did not bid on the mansion during the subsequent auction. The smell of lavender held no value in her world. She purchased only 2 items, her father's vintage cufflinks and a porcelain doll Margaret had once claimed was a priceless heirloom. Forensic analysis revealed the doll to be a mass-produced ceramic from a distant factory. It was a fitting symbol for the legacy Margaret had tried to protect. Margaret Thorne was eventually placed in a state-run medical facility. An anonymous trust, funded by Vance Holdings, ensured that the mother received professional medical care and specialized attention. Marissa did not coordinate a space for her mother, but the CEO ensured the caregiver's wages were paid in full. It was a matter of professional standards, not emotional reconciliation. Margaret had a column on a spreadsheet and a clean bed, which was more than the daughter had been given in the diner 25 years ago. Clara Thorne found employment as a shift manager in a large art supplies warehouse in the city. The woman who had once lived for art galleries was now focused on the logistics of shipping and receiving. The emotional core Clara had worried about was being hardened by the reality of a 40-hour work week and a rented apartment with linoleum floors. Clara never spoke to her sister, but she lived in a city where the name Vance was visible on the skyline of every major healthcare development. The story of the Thorne family became a quiet footnote in the city's history. It was a narrative about the difference between a family built on performance and a life built on substance. Marissa Vance remained a private figure, a woman who understood that the most enduring power is the kind that doesn't need to shout to be felt. The estate at Oak Ridge was eventually converted into a community center, its grand halls filled with people who had no interest in debutante balls or family lineages. The final reflection of the narrative centers on the concept of debt. Margaret Thorne believed Marissa owed her a lifetime of service because of the biological bond of motherhood. Marissa believed that debt had been settled the moment the adoption papers were signed 25 years prior. The audit of the family's life proved that the only person who actually paid their way was the one who had been told they weren't enough. In her final years, Margaret Thorne sat by the window of the medical facility, watching the staff go about their duties. She finally understood that Marissa wasn't cold or difficult. Marissa was simply the only one in the family who knew how to build a house that didn't fall down when the money ran out. The heart of the family had been a luxury, but the logic of the family had been the only thing that kept the lights on in the end. The legacy of Marissa Vance continued to grow. She understood that a house built on stone is the only one that survives the winter. She had taken the coldness her mother had criticized and turned it into a foundation. In a world where people often confuse silence with weakness, Marissa Vance stood as a testament to the fact that those who are comfortable in the silence are usually the ones who end up owning the ground. The conclusion of the Thorne story was not a grand explosion of conflict, but the steady, rhythmic hum of a well-run life. It was a reminder that the roles people assign to others, black sheep, favorite child, invisible daughter, are not permanent. A caregiver can become a titan. A favorite child can become a worker, and a mother can become a line item on a spreadsheet. The final audit was complete. The mother's final account showed a zero balance. There was no anger, no regret, and no longing for a past that had never truly existed. There was only the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had walked out of a lavender-scented tomb and built a city of her own. Marissa Vance had realized that the only inheritance that matters is the resilience a person earns with their own two hands. Everything else is just a ghost. As the sun set over the city, the lights in the Vance Holdings headquarters flickered on. The building was a monument to the girl who had been told she was a contaminant. It was a fortress built on the very logic that had once been used to exclude her. The performance was over. The truth remained. And in that truth, there was a peace that no amount of Thorne heritage could ever buy. Payday had finally arrived. The Thorne name faded into obscurity, but the Vance legacy became a permanent part of the landscape. It was a victory of substance over style, and a victory of the invisible child over the golden one. As the clock in the grand hall struck midnight, the sound echoed through a house that was finally owned by someone who truly knew the cost of every brick.